The wind in Cedar Ridge didn't just bite, it had teeth. And on that February morning in 1873, it was chewing Margaret Donnelly down to the bone. She was going to die. Not in a blaze of glory, not in a warm bed surrounded by family, but frozen solid in the muddy street of a town that didn't want her. She pressed her back against the rough-hewn planks of the general store, trying to borrow a little warmth, a little shelter, but there was none to be had. Her dress, a sad brown thing of thin wool, was in tatters. It was a ghost of a dress, really, clinging to her thin frame like a second, colder skin. She'd walked for 3 days to get here. And for what? To be told no, again and again. To be looked through as if she wasn't even there. She saw a woman coming, a mountain of furs and self-satisfaction. Margaret pushed herself off the wall, her voice a dry rasp against the wind. "Please," she begged. "I'm looking for work. Any work at all. I can cook, I can clean." The woman in the furs didn't even break her stride. She just pulled her shawl tighter, as if Margaret's poverty was a disease you could catch from the air. It was the same story all morning. The men at the saloon, they just laughed. One of them, a man whose teeth were stained the color of rust, nudged his friend. "Another beggar woman," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Town's crawling with 'em." Another man eyed her hands, her bare ring finger. "Probably got herself in trouble," he sneered. "No decent woman travels alone." Margaret's cheeks burned, a strange hot shame in the biting cold. "I'm a widow," she whispered, a lie that felt less shameful than the truth. Her husband hadn't died. He just left. Walked out one morning for a paper of tobacco and never came back. "Sure you are," the first man laughed. "And I'm President Grant. Get on now. We don't want your kind here." She stumbled away, the men's laughter chasing her down the street. She tried the livery stable, but the owner, a man named Jasper, just grunted that it wouldn't be proper for a woman to sleep in his barn. She tried the church, the one place she thought might offer a shred of Christian charity. But the Reverend Whitman stood in the doorway like a guard at the gates of heaven, his arms crossed over his chest. "The church funds," he said, his voice as cold as the wind, "are for members of our congregation." Desperation was a physical thing now, a clawing beast in her stomach. She was starting to feel fuzzy, her thoughts slow and thick like molasses. She'd heard that freezing to death was a peaceful way to go, like falling asleep. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. And that's when she saw the crowd. They were gathered near the general store, a knot of angry, muttering townsfolk. Their voices were sharp, cutting through the howl of the wind. "Don't care if he does trade here regular," one man was saying. "Them Indians got no business walking our streets like they own the place." Margaret drifted closer, drawn by the commotion. And then she saw him. Through a gap in the crowd, she saw the reason for their anger. He was a mountain. That was her first thought. A mountain carved from granite and shadow. He had to be close to 7 feet tall, with shoulders that looked like they could carry the weight of the whole world. His hair was long and black as a raven's wing, tied back in the Apache way. His face was all sharp lines and angles, a face that looked like it had been carved by the same wind that was trying to kill her. He wore a mix of his people's clothes and the white man's, leather leggings, a heavy wool coat, boots that had seen more miles than she could imagine. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from her lungs. They were dark as a moonless night, and they swept over the angry crowd with an expression of utter, complete indifference. He looked at them like they were ants, annoying but ultimately insignificant. When those eyes passed over her, for just a second, she felt a jolt. It wasn't pity, it wasn't curiosity, it was something else. Recognition. Like he saw right through the torn dress and the hunger and the shame, and saw the person shivering underneath. "Joseph Burns says he caught him looking at his daughter," a woman whispered loudly, fanning the flames of the crowd's hatred. "These savages got no control." The Apache man didn't move. He stood as still and silent as the mountains he came from, letting their ugly words wash over him like rain. He didn't seem bothered. He didn't seem scared. He just seemed patient, as if he was waiting for something. Margaret swayed on her feet. The cold, the hunger, the weeks of despair, it was all crashing down on her at once. The world started to tilt. the angry faces of the crowd blurring into a meaningless swirl of color. She reached out for a hitching post to steady herself, but her fingers were numb, useless things of ice. She was falling. She closed her eyes, ready for the impact, ready for the final, merciful darkness. But she never hit the ground. Strong arms caught her, not just caught her, but lifted her up as if she weighed no more than a child's doll. She blinked, dazed, and found herself looking up into those midnight eyes. Up close, she saw they weren't black at all. They were the color of rich, dark earth, deep and ancient, and impossibly calm. The crowd went silent. The angry muttering died on their lips. They just stared, their mouths hanging open, as the giant Apache man held the ragged beggar woman in his arms. He studied her for a moment, his gaze taking in everything: the torn dress, the frost-nipped skin, the utter hopelessness in her eyes. Then, without a single word, he shifted his grip, scooping her up into his arms. One arm solid against her back, the other under her knees. He lifted her as easily as if she were a bundle of firewood. "Put her down!" Someone in the crowd finally managed to shout. "You can't just—" The man's gaze swept over them again. This time, there was something else in it. Not anger, not a threat, just a silent, unbreakable promise. A promise that he was going to do exactly what he wanted, and they were not going to stop him. The crowd, full of brave men just moments before, took a step back, then another. They parted like the Red Sea before Moses. He started walking, carrying her right through the middle of them. Margaret knew she should scream. She should fight, kick, demand to be put down. This was a savage, a heathen. That's what they'd all said. But the warmth from his body, it was the first real heat she'd felt in days. It seeped into her skin, into her bones, chasing away the deadly cold. And without even thinking about it, she found herself curling closer, burying her face against the rough wool of his coat. "Where's he taking her?" she heard someone ask as they walked away. "Someone ought to stop him." "You stop him, Harold," came the nervous reply. But no one moved. They just watched, a strange mix of horror and fascination on their faces, as the Apache giant carried the broken white woman away from their town, away from their judgment. He carried her as if she belonged to him. Margaret's last thought before the warmth and exhaustion finally dragged her into darkness was that his coat smelled of wood smoke and pine trees. It was a clean, honest smell, a smell from a better time, a better life. She let her head rest on his powerful shoulder, and for the first time in months, she stopped fighting. She just let go. Behind them, the town of Cedar Ridge erupted into a storm of gossip and outrage, but the Apache man never looked back. He just kept walking, his steps steady and sure, carrying his unexpected burden through the swirling snow, as if this was what he had been waiting for all along. For Margaret, this wasn't the day her life ended in a frozen street. This was the day it began again. She woke up slowly, floating in a sea of warmth. For a long moment, she didn't know where she was. The last thing she remembered was the cold, the falling, the feeling of being lifted. Now there was only the gentle crackle of a fire and the scent of wood smoke. She opened her eyes. She was in a cabin. It was small, just one room, but the log walls were thick and solid, a fortress against the storm she could still hear howling outside. She was lying on a soft pallet of furs near a stone hearth, where a fire burned bright and steady. Several heavy blankets were piled on top of her. Across the small room he sat, the Apache man. In the flickering firelight, his face was less intimidating, more thoughtful. He seemed younger than she'd first thought, maybe in his mid-30s. His hands, which had lifted her so easily, were busy carving a piece of wood. They moved with a quiet, practiced grace. She tried to sit up, and the movement caught his attention. He set down his carving and looked at her. "Water?" he said. His voice was deep, a low rumble like distant thunder. It wasn't a question. He stood up. He seemed to fill the entire cabin with his presence, and brought a tin cup to her. He helped her sit, his hand gentle on her back, and held the cup to her lips. The water was cool and clean, and it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank it all greedily. "Thank you," she whispered, her own voice sounding foreign and scratchy. He just nodded and went back to the fire, where a small pot was simmering over the flames. The smell that drifted from it made her empty stomach cramp with a painful, desperate hunger. He ladled a thick, rich stew into a wooden bowl and brought it to her. Her hands shook so much she could barely hold the spoon. The first mouthful was pure agony and pure heaven. It was simple food, venison, root vegetables, wild herbs. But to a starving woman, it was a king's feast. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks, hot against her cold skin. He watched her eat, his dark eyes unreadable. He didn't speak, just sat and waited until she had scraped the bowl clean. Only then did he go back to his carving. She watched him now, her belly full, the warmth seeping back into her limbs. She tried to make sense of it. The people in town, her own people, had treated him like a dangerous animal. They'd looked at her with contempt and disgust. Yet this man, this stranger, this savage had shown her a kindness she had forgotten could even exist. It didn't make any sense. "Why?" she asked, the word coming out louder than she intended. He looked up from his work, his hands still. "Why what? Why did you help me?" He was quiet for a long time, so long that she thought he wasn't going to answer. The only sounds were the fire and the wind. Then he looked at her, his gaze direct and simple. "You needed help." That was it. No complicated reason, no hidden motive. For him, it was that simple. You see a person falling, you catch them. You see a person starving, you feed them. He didn't ask what she'd done to end up in the street. He didn't ask if she was a decent woman. He just saw a need and he met it. "They'll talk," she said, thinking of the faces in the crowd. "In town. They'll say terrible things. About you. About me." A corner of his mouth twitched, but it wasn't a smile. "They already say terrible things." His voice was flat, without a trace of anger or self-pity. It was just a fact, like saying the sky is blue or the winter is cold. "I have nothing," she said, her voice breaking. She looked down at her hands at the tattered dress. "No money. I can't repay you." Did not ask for payment. "But I can't just stay here. I should go." She made a move to get up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. "Storm," he said simply, nodding toward the single window. Through the small pane, she could see nothing but a swirling wall of white. "Stay. Tonight. Decide tomorrow." He took the empty bowl from her and washed it in a basin in the corner. She watched him move around the small space. Everything had its place. His tools were hung on pegs. Furs and supplies were stacked neatly on shelves. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was out of order. This was the home of a man who lived a careful, deliberate life. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly. He glanced over his shoulder. "They call me Tom. Tom Crow Feather." "Is that your real name?" A shadow of a real smile touched his lips this time. "Real enough for a white man's town." "I'm Margaret," she offered. "Margaret Donnelly." He nodded, a silent acknowledgement. He had given her a place to sleep right by the hearth, the warmest spot in the cabin. She realized he had only a simple bedroll for himself, tucked away in the coldest corner. "I can sleep in the barn," she said. "I really don't mind. I've slept in worse places." He shook his head. "No barn, just this." He gestured around the small cabin. Then, "Where will you sleep?" He pointed to the bedroll. "I have slept in worse places, too." The wind outside seemed to find a new fury, rattling the wooden shutters. Margaret shivered, pulling the blankets tighter. She couldn't stop thinking about the crowd's angry faces. "They think you're dangerous," she said quietly. He didn't look up from his carving. "I am dangerous," he said, and the simple statement sent a chill down her spine. He said it without any pride or menace. It was just another fact. "To those who would harm what is mine." The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Am I yours now?" He finally looked up and his dark eyes held hers. For a long moment the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken things. "You are no one's," he said at last. "But under my roof, you are under my protection." And there were those tears again, stinging her eyes. Protection? When was the last time anyone had offered her that? Her husband? Her father? The words just started spilling out of her then, a flood of misery she'd held back for months. My husband left me, she said, the sound of her own voice raw and ugly. 8 months ago. Just vanished. Left me with nothing but his debts. My father, my father said I'd shame the family. He said a woman who couldn't keep her husband was no daughter of his. He shut the door in my face. She told him everything. About the lonely nights, the hunger, the shame that was like a constant, bitter taste in her mouth. About how in every new town, the whispers followed her. That's the woman whose husband ran off. Must be something wrong with her. Tom just kept carving, his knife moving steadily over the wood. But she knew he was listening. Every word. I thought Cedar Ridge would be different, she finished, her voice choked with a bitter laugh. A bigger town. I thought maybe someone would need help badly enough not to care. But it's the same everywhere. A woman alone, you're either a target or a disgrace. Tom was quiet for a moment after she finished. White men's ways, he said, his voice low. Apache way is different. A woman alone is not shameful. Sometimes necessary. Sometimes strong. I don't feel strong, she whispered. He finally set his carving down. Walked 3 days in a storm. No food, no shelter. He shrugged, a simple, powerful gesture. Still standing. That is strong. She'd never thought of it that way. She'd only thought of it as desperation. Survival. Not strength. What will people say? She asked again, the fear of their judgment still a raw wound. A white woman, staying with an Apache man? They will say whatever they want to say, he answered. Their words change nothing inside these walls. They could make trouble for you. He picked up his carving again. They could try. There was a finality in his tone, a quiet confidence that was more convincing than any boast. This was a man who knew what he could handle. A fierce gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making the whole structure groan. Tom got up and checked the bar on the door, making sure it was secure. When he turned back, his face was serious. Tomorrow, he said, if the storm breaks, I go to town. Trade pelts. You decide then. Stay or go. And if I stay, he didn't hesitate, then you stay. But what would I do? I have to earn my keep. Plenty of work, he said, glancing around the cabin. Garden needs tending in the spring. Clothes need mending. Game needs dressing. He looked at her then, a direct challenge in his eyes. If you want work. A tiny spark flickered to life inside her, something she hadn't felt in so long she had almost forgotten its name. Hope. Yes, she said, her voice stronger now. Yes, I want to work. He gave a single satisfied nod and went back to his carving. The storm raged on, but inside the small, warm cabin, a fragile peace had settled. Margaret felt herself starting to drift off to sleep, warm and full, and for the first time in an eternity, safe. Just before she slipped into unconsciousness, she heard Tom moving quietly about the cabin, banking the fire for the night, settling onto his bedroll in the corner. Thank you, she mumbled into the darkness. His only reply was a quiet grunt. Sleep. She closed her eyes. The people of Cedar Ridge had warned her about the dangerous savage who lived in the mountains, but the only danger she had found in this town was in their own hard, closed hearts. Here, in this cabin with a man who asked no questions and made no judgments, she was safer than she had ever been. Tomorrow she would have to decide, but tonight she was just warm, and for now that was more than enough. The world was silent when she woke. The storm had blown itself out, leaving a thick blanket of white over everything, muffling the world in a profound quiet. Tom was already up, standing by the small window, looking out at the transformed landscape. In the clean morning light, the cabin looked even more orderly, more peaceful. His rifle stood in the corner, well-oiled and ready. It wasn't a threat, it was a tool, just like the axe by the door and the knives on the wall. Everything here had a purpose. Morning, he said, without turning around. Coffee. He poured her a cup from a pot warming by the fire. It was black and strong, and it chased away the last of the sleep from her mind. Storm past, he said. Trail to town will be clear by afternoon. There it was, the decision, looming over her like a thundercloud. She could go back to the judgment, the sneers, the hunger, or she could stay here in this strange sanctuary with this strange, quiet man. She watched him as he moved about the cabin, preparing a simple breakfast of fried bread and dried meat. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet efficiency that was almost mesmerizing. There was no wasted energy, no wasted space. He set a plate in front of her. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it for more than just the food. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the scrape of forks on tin plates. What would they do? The question burned in her mind. What would the people in town do if they found out she was still here? "They will talk," Tom said, as if reading her thoughts. "Always they talk. Maybe make threats." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "And nothing. This is my land, my business." "But you're trading," she pressed. "They could refuse to trade with you." "Have traded there for 10 years, he said with a shrug. "They need my furs, my meat. Their hate is a luxury. Their need is a fact. Business is business." She thought about that. He was right. Even with all their hostility the day before, no one had actually tried to stop him from entering the store. They needed him, whether they liked it or not. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, "to face them, to live with their judgment." He looked at her then, his gaze direct. "Not asking you to face them, asking if you want work, a roof, food." He gestured around the cabin. "This is not town." She understood. He wasn't offering her a life in Cedar Ridge. He was offering her a life away from it, a refuge. Here in the isolation of the mountains, their words couldn't reach her. Their stares couldn't burn her. She could just be. The word came out of her before she even had a chance to think about it. A single powerful syllable of surrender and defiance. "Yes." He nodded as if he had known all along what her answer would be. "Good. Much work to do." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of instruction. He showed her the spring behind the cabin, the root cellar dug into the hillside, the shed where he kept his tools. "Garden is there," he said, pointing to a snow-covered patch of cleared land. "Come spring, it needs planting. You know garden work?" "Yes," she said, a pang of memory hitting her. "I had a garden back home, before." "Good," he said. "Also, trap line needs checking. Can teach you to skin, prepare pelts." The thought made her stomach turn, but she nodded anyway. She had asked for work. She would not be picky. As the afternoon sun climbed high in the sky, Tom began to prepare for his trip to town. "Need supplies," he said, pulling on the heavy wool coat she remembered from the day before. "Be back before dark." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch, and looked back at her. "Bar the door behind me," he said, his voice low and serious. "Don't open it, for anyone." A shiver of fear, cold and sharp, ran down her spine. "Are you expecting trouble?" "No," he said, "but caution is a good friend." He left, and she slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the cabin. The little room felt huge and empty without him. She moved around it, touching things, trying to make this strange place feel like hers. She found his carving from the night before sitting on a shelf. It was a bird, its wings spread wide as if it were just taking flight. The detail was incredible. She could see every single feather. What kind of man could be so strong and so gentle at the same time? Time dragged on. She tended the fire. She washed her face and hair, wincing at the gaunt, wild-eyed stranger who looked back at her from the small piece of polished tin that served as a mirror. She was trying to comb the knots out of her hair when she heard them. Horses, at least 2 or 3 of them, coming up the trail fast. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She scrambled to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. It was the law. Deputy Bryson, the man from the saloon, sat on his horse in the middle of the clearing, flanked by 2 other men she didn't recognize. Their faces were hard, their eyes cold. They looked like hunters who had cornered their prey. "Hello, the house!" Bryson called out, his voice full of false cheer. "We know you're in there, woman. We saw the Apache leave for town." Margaret froze, Tom's warning ringing in her ears. "Don't open it. For anyone." Come on out now, Bryson continued. We're here to help you. Take you back to civilization, where you belong. Still, she didn't move. She didn't make a sound. She barely even breathed. Don't be a fool, woman, one of the other men shouted. You think that savage has good intentions? He's probably got you under some kind of spell. You're just a plaything to him. Go away, Margaret finally called out, her voice shaking but clear. I'm fine where I am. Bryson let out a short, ugly laugh. You don't know what you're saying. You're not thinking straight. Open this door, or we'll open it for you. Her mind raced. The door was strong. The bar was heavy. But 3 determined men could break it down. She looked at Tom's rifle in the corner. She didn't even know how to load it, let alone fire it. Last chance, woman, Bryson shouted. Come out peaceful, or we're coming in. And then a sound that split the cold, clean air. A single rifle shot. It didn't come from the cabin. It came from the trees. The horses shied, snorting in alarm. The 3 men spun around in their saddles. That's far enough, gentlemen. It was Tom's voice, but it was different now. It was flat and cold, and carried an edge as sharp as a razor. Margaret scrambled back to the window. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by a massive pine tree. The rifle was resting in his hands as if it were a part of him, steady and calm and deadly. Now, Tom, Bryson said, trying to sound reasonable, but his voice was tight with fear. We're just trying to help the lady. She's clearly not in her right mind. The lady has made her choice, Tom cut him off. You will respect it. Or what? One of the other men sneered. You'll shoot a deputy of the law? That's a hanging offense, boy. Self-defense is no crime, Tom said, his voice unchanging. You are on my land. You are threatening my guest. Leave, now. Bryson's face was a mask of fury and humiliation. This isn't over, he snarled. There are laws about white women and Indians. Moral laws. You're corrupting her, and the good people of Cedar Ridge won't stand for it. The good people of Cedar Ridge let her freeze in their streets, Tom replied, and the simple, brutal truth of his words seemed to suck the air out of the clearing. Their morality means nothing here. Bryson stared at Tom for a long moment, his eyes full of hate. Then he yanked on his horse's reins, turning it so sharply the animal reared. You'll regret this, he spat, his words directed at the cabin, at Margaret. Both of you. Mark my words. They galloped away, their angry shouts echoing through the trees. Margaret sagged against the wall, her legs suddenly weak with relief. A moment later, she heard Tom's footsteps on the porch. She fumbled with the bar, her hands shaking, and pulled the door open. He stepped inside, placing his rifle back in its corner. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. You stayed, he said finally. It wasn't a question. You told me to bar the door, she replied, a watery smile touching her lips, and not to open it for anyone. A faint smile touched his own lips in return. Good. He unslung the pack he was carrying and set it on the table. It was full of supplies: flour, salt, coffee, bullets, and something else, a bundle of cloth. This is for you, he said, handing it to her. Dress needs mending, but it is warm. She unfolded it. It was a simple woolen dress, a deep forest green, plain but well made. Tears filled her eyes again. After months of cruelty, of being treated as less than human, this simple act of kindness was almost too much to bear. I can't pay for this, she whispered. Already said, he grunted, turning back to his supplies. Not asking for payment. You need clothes for winter. This is practical. They'll come back, she said, clutching the dress to her chest. Bryson and his men. They'll be back. Maybe, Tom said, arranging the supplies on the shelves with his usual care. Probably. His calmness was infuriating and strangely comforting. Why are you doing this? She asked, the question bursting out of her. Why risk a hanging for me? A stranger? He stopped what he was doing and turned to face her. Long ago, he began, his voice low, my mother was cast out by her people. She married a white trapper against tribal law. When he died, she had nowhere to go. No one would help her. Not her Apache family, not the White Town. She starved to death. I was 12 winters old. The story hung in the air between them, stark and brutal. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, the words feeling small and useless. "Not your fault," he said, "but I remember. I remember how they looked at her, like she was nothing. I remember her begging for someone, anyone to help." He went back to his work. "You needed help," he said, his back to her. "I could give it. But it wasn't that simple, and she knew it. Nothing about this was simple. This quiet, dangerous man hadn't just offered her a roof and a meal. He had offered her his protection. He had stood against the law for her. He had made her his business. As evening fell, they shared another meal in silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was filled with unspoken things, with the weight of the day's events, with the ghost of a starving woman and the fury of a humiliated deputy. The people of Cedar Ridge had drawn a line in the snow, and Margaret and Tom were on the other side of it, together. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange, tense peace. It was the quiet before a battle. Margaret fell into the rhythm of life in the cabin. She patched the green dress Tom had given her. She learned to scrape the fat from a rabbit pelt without tearing the skin. Her hands, once soft and useless, grew calloused and strong. She found a surprising satisfaction in the hard, honest work. But every time Tom went to town, he came back with a shadow in his eyes. The whispers in Cedar Ridge had grown into a roar. "They are calling you names," he told her one night, his voice tight as he stared into the fire. "Ugly names." "What name?" she asked, her own voice steady. She needed to know. She needed to face it. "It does not matter. Words of small, frightened men." "Tell me, Tom." He finally looked at her, his eyes dark with a shared pain. "They call you his barn rat. They say you will sleep with anything, anywhere, for a scrap of food." Margaret flinched as if he'd struck her. The ugly words echoed what she had once thought of herself, what she had been willing to do. "They call you a ruined woman," he continued, his voice low and hard. "They say no decent man would ever have you now, living here with an Apache." "They're not wrong," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "By their rules, I am ruined. My husband left me. My family cast me out. And now I'm living with a man who is not my husband. In their world, there is no greater sin." Tom's eyes flashed with a fire she had never seen before. "Their rules mean nothing," he said, his voice a low growl. "You work hard. You are honest. You harm no one. That is not ruined. That is honor." But their poison had found her. The fragile peace she had built for herself began to crumble. When she looked at her reflection now, she saw what they saw: a fallen woman, a creature of shame. The town's judgment wasn't content to stay in town. One afternoon, while she was hanging washed clothes on a line Tom had strung between two pines, she saw them coming, a group of women on horseback, led by Mrs. Morrison, the wife of the general store owner. They stopped just at the edge of the clearing, as if afraid to get too close. "Margaret Donnelly," Mrs. Morrison called out, her voice dripping with righteous piety, "we have come to appeal to what little decency you have left." Margaret's first instinct was to run, to hide inside the cabin, but she forced her feet to move forward. She would not be a coward. "You are living in open, shameless sin," another woman declared, "with a heathen savage. Have you no thought for your immortal soul?" "I am working," Margaret said, her voice tight. "There is no sin in honest work." Mrs. Morrison let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Work? Is that what you call it? We all know what kind of work a woman does for a man she isn't married to." The accusation was so vile, so direct, it left Margaret speechless. "It's not like that," she finally stammered. "Then marry him," a younger woman challenged, her eyes bright with malice. "If it's all so innocent, make it proper in the eyes of God and man." "Marry an Indian?" Mrs. Morrison looked as if she might faint from the very idea. "That would be an even greater sin. You must leave this place, Margaret. Repent. Perhaps you can still salvage something of your reputation." "There's nothing left to salvage," Margaret said, a bitter anger rising in her. "You all made sure of that when I was starving in your street." "That was a test from God," Mrs. Morrison shot back. "A test you clearly failed by turning to this creature. Just then, Tom stepped out of the cabin. He didn't have his rifle. He didn't need it. His very presence was enough to make the women's horses shift and snort nervously. "Ladies," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "you are not welcome here." "We are trying to save her soul," Mrs. Morrison insisted, though she was already pulling on her horse's reins. "Her soul is her own business," Tom said. "Leave, now." They rode off, but their parting shots hung in the air like smoke. "We will pray for you, Margaret. Pray you come to your senses before it's too late." "Don't listen to them," Tom said after they were gone. But how could she not? Their words were like burrs, sticking to her, working their way under her skin. The harassment grew worse. Every trip Tom made to town was a trial. Then came the night visits. It started with voices in the dark, shouting obscene things from the edge of the trees. Tom would grab his rifle and go outside, but they were always gone, their cowardly laughter echoing in the night. A week later they came back. This time they threw rocks against the cabin walls. One shattered the small window, sending a spray of glass across the floor. "They are cowards," Tom said as he boarded up the window, "only brave in the dark, in a pack." But Margaret was terrified. She couldn't sleep. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sent her heart racing. She was a prisoner in her own sanctuary. And then came the night that everything changed forever. She was jolted awake by a sound that shook the entire cabin, a violent, splintering pounding on the door. "Open up, Deputy Bryson! I've got a warrant for the woman. Suspicion of theft and prostitution." Tom was already on his feet, his rifle in his hands. "There is no theft here," he called out. "No prostitution. Go away." "Can't do that, Tom. Got legal papers this time. She comes with us, or we're coming in to get her." "Show me the papers," Tom demanded. "Through the window." "I don't need to show you nothing, Indian. Open this door." Either, Margaret could hear them now, multiple voices laughing and cursing. They were a mob. "Maybe I should go," she whispered, her teeth chattering with fear. "If they have a warrant?" "There is no warrant," Tom said, his voice grim. "He lies. No judge would sign such a thing without proof." The pounding grew more ferocious. The solid wood of the door began to groan. "Last chance, Tom. Send her out, and we leave peaceful. You keep her, and things are gonna get real ugly." Tom moved to the boarded-up window, peering through a small crack. When he turned back to her, his face was pale. His expression was one she had never seen before. It was fear, not for himself, for her. "They brought rope," he said, and the single word was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. Rope. A lynching. 10 seconds, Tom," Bryson bellowed. "Then we're coming in." Tom turned to her, his eyes blazing with a desperate urgency. "The back room," he said, shoving her toward a small storage area at the back of the cabin. "Get in, bar the door, and no matter what you hear, no matter what happens, do not come out." "Tom, no. Go, now!" She scrambled into the tiny room, her heart pounding in her throat, and dropped the heavy bar across the door, just as she heard the front door of the cabin splinter and burst inward. The sounds that followed would be burned into her memory for the rest of her life. The crash of furniture, the sound of curses and grunts, the sickening, meaty thud of fists hitting flesh. She heard Tom's rifle fire once, a deafening roar in the small space, and then the sound of it clattering to the floor. More shouting, more breaking things. And then, a sound that was even more terrifying. Silence. "Where is she?" It was Bryson's voice, ragged and out of breath. There was no answer. "Hit him again," Bryson ordered. "Make the savage talk." She heard the sound of another blow, a pained grunt, but still, Tom said nothing. A sob caught in Margaret's throat. She pressed her hands to her mouth to keep from screaming. He was taking a beating for her. He was enduring this pain to protect her. "Check the back room," someone shouted. Footsteps pounded across the floor. The handle on her door rattled violently. "It's barred from the inside. She's in there." "Margaret Donnelly!" It was Bryson again, his voice right outside her door. "Come on out now, and we'll go easy on you. You make us break this door down, and I can't promise what might happen to you, or your Indian." The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. We got him tied up good, Bryson continued. But he's still breathing. For now. You come out peaceful, he stays that way. You make us work for it. He let the sentence hang. Margaret closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't do it. She couldn't let them kill him because of her. With a trembling hand, she reached for the bar. And that's when she heard it. A new voice. Loud, powerful, and utterly furious. What in the name of God Almighty is going on in here? Bryson sounded like he'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Judge Morrison! Sir, you were just breaking and entering, from what I can see, the new voice boomed, and committing assault. Did you happen to bring that warrant with you, Deputy? Well, not a signed warrant exactly, but then you are here illegally, attacking a man in his own home. Cut him loose, immediately. But sir, the woman. What woman? The judge's voice was ice. I see a man defending his property from a pack of criminals. Unless you have legal papers, Deputy, you are the ones breaking the law. Now get out of my sight before I have every last one of you thrown in jail. She heard a frantic scrambling, muttered curses. This ain't over, Bryson snarled. Oh yes, it is, Judge Morrison replied, his voice dangerously soft. Because any man I find on this property again, without a legal signed warrant, will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Am I clear? She waited until the sound of the horses had faded into the distance. Then slowly she lifted the bar and opened the door. The cabin was destroyed. Furniture was smashed, supplies scattered across the floor. Tom was sitting on the floor, propped against the wall. His face was a mess of cuts and bruises. Blood trickled from a gash over his eye, and the raw, red marks of the rope were on his wrists. Judge Morrison, an older man with a stern face and eyes that missed nothing, was standing in the doorway. Are you all right, miss? He asked her. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She rushed to Tom's side, dropping to her knees beside him. I'll be going, the judge said. He looked at Tom. Son, you might want to consider making certain legal arrangements. It would solve a great many of your problems. He tipped his hat and was gone. Margaret cleaned Tom's wounds, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the cloth. I'm so sorry, she whispered, over and over again. This is all my fault. I'll leave. In the morning, No! His hand, bruised and scraped, shot out and grabbed hers, stopping her. His grip was surprisingly strong. You stay. But they'll come back. They'll just keep coming back until I'm gone. Then we face them, he said, his voice raspy but firm. Together. She looked at him, at his battered face, at the fierce, protective light that still burned in his eyes. This man who owed her nothing had just endured a brutal beating rather than give her up. Why? She asked again, the question raw with emotion. He didn't answer with a story this time. He just looked at her, his dark eyes seeing right into her soul. Because you are not nothing, he said, his voice low and intense. Not a barn rat, not ruined. He paused and a faint, crooked smile touched his swollen lips. You are Margaret. You work hard. You do not complain. You make good coffee. He squeezed her hand. Worth fighting for. And that's when she finally broke. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder, and she cried. Not tears of fear or despair, but tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. The sun was just starting to rise, its pale light filtering through the broken doorway. They had survived the night, and whatever came next, they would face it, together. The days after the attack were quiet, too quiet. It was the silence of a held breath, the calm in the eye of a hurricane. The cabin was repaired, the broken furniture mended or replaced, but the memory of the violence lingered, a ghost in the corners of the room. Margaret poured herself into her work. It was the only way to keep the fear at bay. She learned to tan a deer hide until it was soft and supple. She learned which plants could be used for medicine and which for dye. And in the evenings, by the light of the fire, she watched Tom carve. He had always carved, but now there was a new intensity to his work. He would sit for hours, the knife in his hand moving with a sure, steady rhythm, his brow furrowed in concentration. One night she finally asked him, "What are you making?" He didn't answer right away. He made a few more careful cuts, then held the piece of wood out to her. It was a bird, a small plain sparrow, its wings folded tight, its head tucked down as if bracing against a fierce wind. "It's beautiful," she said, tracing the delicate carved feathers with her fingertip. "But why a sparrow?" "Small bird," he said, his eyes still on the carving. "Common. People think it is nothing." He took it back from her, turning it over in his hands. "But it survives the winter when the bigger, brighter birds fly south. It is stronger than it looks." She understood. He was carving her, or at least his idea of her. The thought sent a strange, warm feeling spreading through her chest. After that, the carvings started to appear all over the cabin. A rabbit, its ears perked, alert and ready to run. A deer, its lines graceful, but with a weariness in its stance. A lone wolf, proud and defiant. He never said they were for her, but she would find them in the morning, placed carefully on the shelf above her sleeping pallet. "You could sell these," she told him one day, "in town. They're incredible." He just shrugged. "That is not why I make them." "Then why?" she pressed. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames in the hearth. "My grandfather taught me," he said finally. He said the spirits of the animals are held inside the wood waiting. The carver's job is not to create something new, but to find what is already there, to free it. He looked at her then, his gaze deep and meaningful. Sometimes a person needs to see their own spirit, to remember what they are. That night she gathered all the small wooden animals and lined them up on the mantelpiece. The sparrow, the rabbit, the deer, the wolf. Each one was a testament to survival. Each one possessed a quiet, stubborn strength. Was this really how he saw her? Not as the broken, shamed woman the world saw, but as something resilient? Something worthy of being freed? The next morning brought a surprise, an unexpected visitor. Margaret was out back, splitting kindling, when she heard a single horse approaching. Her body went rigid, the axe freezing in mid-swing. But it was a woman, riding alone. As she got closer, Margaret recognized her. It was Helen Baker, the town schoolteacher. She was younger than the other women who had come to harass her, with a plain, serious face. "Miss Donnelly," Helen called out, reining in her horse but not dismounting. "May I have a word?" Margaret walked toward her, cautious, wary. "If you've come to lecture me—" "I've come to apologize," Helen interrupted, her voice low, "and to warn you." Margaret stopped, surprised. She searched the other woman's face for any sign of a trick, but all she saw was genuine sincerity and fear. "Warn me about what?" "There's talk in town," Helen said, glancing around nervously as if the trees themselves had ears. "Ugly talk. Deputy Bryson is telling everyone that Tom has you under some kind of Indian spell, that you're not in your right mind. He's trying to get the territorial judge to have you declared incompetent, to have you removed from here for your own good." "But Judge Morrison—" "The judge is only in town twice a month," Helen said quickly. "The rest of the time, Bryson is the law, and he's convincing people. He's twisting it into a crusade to protect white womanhood." A cold dread seeped into Margaret's bones. They wouldn't give up. They would just find another way, a legal way. "What can I do?" "I don't know," Helen admitted, "but I thought you should be prepared." She hesitated, then reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "I brought you this. It's not much, but—" Margaret unwrapped it. Inside were needles, spools of good, strong thread, a tiny, sharp pair of scissors, and several yards of plain, sturdy fabric. "I can't take this," Margaret said, though her fingers longed to touch the smooth cloth. "Please," Helen insisted. "It doesn't make up for my cowardice, but maybe it will help. I have to go." She turned her horse, then paused. "He is a good man, you know. Your Tom. He sees your worth when the rest of us were too blind or too afraid to look." After Helen was gone, Margaret sat with the sewing supplies in her lap. The small act of kindness, of defiance, sparked an idea. A desperate, crazy idea. but it was the only one she had. When Tom came back from checking his traps, she was waiting for him. She held up the fabric Helen had given her. "I want to make something," she said, her voice filled with a new determination. "Something to sell. If I can earn money, real money, then they can't say I'm just his property. They'll have to see me as a person, a businesswoman." Tom studied her face for a long moment. "You want their approval?" "I want them to leave us alone," she corrected. "And in their world, money speaks louder than gossip." He nodded slowly. "What will you make?" "Shirts," she said. "Proper shirts. The men in town, their clothes are a mess. Mended tears, crooked seams. My mother, my mother made me learn fine needlework. I can do better." Tom helped her clear a space by the window, where the light was best. For the next 2 days, she worked with a feverish intensity. Her needle flew, the stitches small and even. And as she worked, Tom sat nearby, carving. This time she could see what he was making. It was a woman, head bent over her sewing, her expression one of deep, unbroken concentration. It was her. "I don't look afraid," she said softly when he was finished. "Because you are not," he answered without looking up. "Not when you work. When you work, you remember who you are." He was right. When she was sewing, she wasn't the abandoned wife, the beggar, the ruined woman. She was a seamstress, a creator, someone with a skill, a purpose. The night she finished the first shirt, she held it up for him to see. It was a simple work shirt, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. The seams were straight as an arrow. The collar lay perfectly flat. Tom took it from her, examining it with the same careful eye he used to judge a pelt. "Good," he said, the single word of praise making her heart swell. "Very good." That night, as they ate their dinner, she found herself thinking about Judge Morrison's words. Legal arrangements, marriage. A few months ago, the idea of marrying an Apache would have been unthinkable, a horror. But now, she looked at Tom across the fire, at his quiet strength, at his hands which could be so gentle, at the memory of him standing between her and a mob. "Tom," she said suddenly, "when Judge Morrison talked about legal arrangements, what did he mean?" He grew very still, his food forgotten. He turned his head and looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "You know what he meant." "Yes, but is that even allowed? For us?" "It is legal," he said slowly, "but it is not accepted. It would cause more talk, more trouble." "Or it might solve our problems," she countered. "It would make it harder for them to take me away." He was quiet for a long time. "I think," he said at last, his voice very low, "a woman deserves a man who offers marriage because he wants her, not because the law says it is a smart move." The air in the cabin suddenly felt very thick. She could feel the heat rising in her own cheeks. "And you don't want me?" "I did not say that," he said, and his gaze was so intense it was almost a physical touch. "I said you deserve better than a marriage of convenience." Before she could find the words to respond, they heard it. The sound she had been dreading. Horses. A lot of them, moving fast. In an instant, Tom was on his feet, the rifle in his hand. "Stay inside," he ordered. But it was too late. A voice slick with smug triumph echoed through the clearing. "Tom, we know you're in there. Both of you, come on out. We've come to have a little talk." It was Deputy Bryson, and this time he'd brought half the town with him. Tom's face was grim. "They do not learn," he muttered, checking the load in his rifle. "Wait," Margaret said, a sudden wild idea taking hold. "Don't shoot. Let me try something." Before he could stop her, she snatched the new shirt from the table and walked to the door. "I'm coming out," she called, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm unarmed. I just want to talk." She opened the door and stepped out onto the small porch, holding the shirt up in front of her like a white flag of surrender. The clearing was filled with men on horseback, at least a dozen of them. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering light of torches, were hard and grim. They looked like a hunting party that had finally cornered its quarry. Bryson's triumphant sneer faltered, replaced by a look of confusion. "What is this?" he demanded. "What kind of trick are you playing?" "It's not a trick, Deputy," Margaret said. her voice carrying in the cold night air. It's a business proposition. Business? Bryson spat the word out like it was poison. The only business we have here is dragging you out of this den of sin. Look at this shirt, she said, ignoring him, stepping further into the torchlight. She held it up for them all to see. Look at the quality, the stitching. Despite themselves, a few of the men leaned forward in their saddles, their eyes drawn to the object in her hands. She recognized Samuel Hart, the owner of the feed store, and Marcus Webb, the town blacksmith. They were businessmen, pragmatists. So you can sew a shirt, Bryson said with a dismissive wave. What of it? How many of you, Margaret pressed on, her voice growing stronger, more confident, are tired of paying outrageous prices for shirts shipped all the way from Denver? How many of you have wives who are too busy with 100 other chores to do fine needlework? A low murmur went through the crowd. She had their attention. I can make shirts, she declared, better shirts than you can buy, and I can make them faster and cheaper. We don't want anything from you, woman, someone shouted from the back. But Marcus Webb, the blacksmith, was looking at the shirt with a professional's eye. That is fine work, he admitted, his voice a low grumble. She's trying to distract us, Bryson insisted, seeing his control over the mob begin to slip. This isn't about shirts, it's about morality. Which is what, exactly? Tom's voice, deep and calm, came from the doorway behind her. He stood there, his rifle held loosely at his side, a silent, powerful presence. Do you have a legal warrant this time, deputy? Or is this another social call? Bryson's face flushed a dark, ugly red. I don't need a warrant to protect a white woman from corruption. I am not corrupted, Margaret said firmly. I am employed. And now I am starting a business. Since when is honest labor a sin in this town? It's a sin when you're living with a heathen, a man shouted. And that's when something inside Margaret finally snapped. The fear, the shame, the months of humiliation. It all burned away, replaced by a clean, hot fire of pure rage. You want to talk about sin? She said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Let's talk about sin. Is it a sin to let a woman nearly freeze to death in your street because her husband left her? Is it a sin to turn away someone begging for a chance to work just because she doesn't have a man to vouch for her? You talk about corruption? The only corruption I see is in your own hearts. Hearts so hard and so full of hate that you would rather see me dead than see me helped by a man you consider beneath you? Watch your tongue, woman, Bryson warned, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. Or what, deputy? She shot back, taking a step toward him. You'll beat me too? Like you beat Tom? You'll show everyone what brave Christian men you are? She let out a bitter laugh. You call him a savage, but he has shown me more decency, more humanity in a few weeks than I have seen from any of you in my entire life. Margaret, Tom said softly from the doorway. A warning. She was pushing them too far, but it was too late. Marcus Webb had swung down from his horse. He walked toward her, his expression unreadable. Let me see that shirt, he said. She handed it to him. He turned it over in his big calloused hands, examining the seams in the torchlight. He was a craftsman himself. He knew quality when he saw it. This is better work than my wife does, he said finally, his voice full of grudging respect. And a damn sight better than what that traveling peddler sells. Marcus, you can't be serious, Bryson protested. I need new shirts, Webb said, his eyes fixed on Margaret. Good ones. And I don't much care where a person sleeps, so long as they do good work. He looked up at her. How much? The question hung in the air, a direct challenge to Bryson and everything he stood for. $2 for a fine shirt like this one? Margaret said, her voice steady. $1 for a simple work shirt. That's Denver prices, Samuel Hart called out. For Denver quality, Margaret countered. And you don't have to wait 6 weeks for the stagecoach. This was a language they understood. Profit, loss, value. The mood of the crowd was shifting. You could feel it. The righteous anger was draining away, replaced by a merchant's calculations. This is madness, Bryson roared, seeing his crusade falling apart. She's a whore and he's a savage. He's a man who pays his debts, Webb interrupted, his voice sharp. which is more than I can say for some white men in this town. He turned back to Margaret. I'll take two, a black one for church and a gray one for every day. Marcus! Bryson's voice was a howl of disbelief. It's just business, Bryson, Webb said. When can you have them ready? 2 weeks, Margaret said, her mind reeling. I might be interested in a couple myself, Hart said slowly. If the quality is as good as Webb says. Bryson's face was a mask of pure hatred. He turned his horse, pointing a shaking finger at Margaret. You think you're clever, don't you? This changes nothing. You are still what you are, a stain on this community, and one way or another, we will wash you out. That is quite enough, Deputy. A new voice cut through the tension like a sharp knife. Judge Morrison rode into the clearing, his face set like stone. He hadn't come alone. Behind him were the town doctor and 2 other respected merchants. It was clear he had been waiting, listening in the darkness. Judge! Bryson stammered. Are you threatening this woman, Deputy? The judge asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Because it certainly sounds like you are. No, sir. We were just, expressing our concern. Your concern looks a lot like a lynch mob, the judge said coldly. Mr. Webb is commissioning some shirts. Mr. Hart is doing the same. That is called commerce. It is the lifeblood of this territory, and it is not your place to interfere. But she's living with... As far as I can see, the judge cut him off, Miss Donnelly has established herself as a seamstress. Unless you have actual evidence of a crime, I suggest you and your concerned citizens go home. Now. Bryson knew he was beaten. He glared at Margaret, his eyes promising revenge. This isn't over, he snarled, the same old threat. No, it is not, Judge Morrison agreed, his voice like silk and steel. Because if I hear of one more midnight visit to this property, one more threat, I will be issuing a warrant. For your arrest, are we clear? The mob dissolved, melting back into the darkness from which they came. As they left, Judge Morrison looked at Margaret, a glimmer of approval in his stern eyes. That was a bold move, Miss Donnelly. Very bold. But he's right about one thing. This is not over. A man like Bryson does not forgive or forget. He glanced from her to Tom, who was still standing silent in the doorway. My earlier advice still stands. Legal protection is a powerful thing. He tipped his hat and rode away, leaving them in a sudden, ringing silence. You took a big risk, Tom said, after the last of the hoofbeats had faded. I'm tired of being afraid, Margaret said. I'm tired of letting them define me. He came and stood beside her on the porch. You spoke like a warrior. I was terrified, she admitted. The best warriors always are, he said. Fear keeps you careful. Careful keeps you alive. They went back inside. The cabin, which had felt like a trap just moments before, now felt like a fortress. Her fortress. She picked up the fabric Helen had given her, her mind already racing with designs. Will they really come back? She asked. Webb and Hart? Or will Bryson scare them off? They will come, Tom said. Men like that understand quality and profit. But Bryson, he feeds on hate. A man like that does not stop so long as he has something to hate. Margaret thought about the judge's words again. Legal protection. Tom, she said, turning to face him, about what the judge said. You want protection? He asked, his eyes searching hers. I want, she began, then stopped, trying to find the right words. Tonight, when I stood up to them, you were there, behind me, not fighting for me, not treating me like I was weak, just there, ready. She looked up at him. I've never had that before. Someone who trusts me to fight my own battles, but who stands with me so I don't have to fight them alone. You are strong enough, he said, his voice soft. I saw it the first day, in town. You were beaten down, but you were not broken, like a bird with a wounded wing. It just needs a safe place to heal. Then it flies again. Is that why you helped me? Because you saw something worth saving? No, he said, and he took a step closer. The small space between them crackled with an energy she had never felt before. I helped you because it was the right thing to do. I want you to stay because you do not look at me and see a savage. You look at me and you see Tom. And you don't look at me and see a ruined woman, she whispered. You see Margaret. Never ruined, he said, his voice fierce. Gold does not become ruined when it is tested by fire. It becomes pure. I'm not gold, Tom. Yes, he said, his hand coming up to gently touch her cheek. His touch was warm, calloused, and it sent a shiver through her entire body. You are, and you are more than enough. The question came out of her in a rush, a torrent of hope and fear. If we did what the judge said, if we married, it wouldn't be just for protection, not for me. He was very still. What would it be for? For this, she said, her voice trembling. For this quiet, for knowing someone has my back, for the way you look at me. She took a shaky breath. Maybe for love. Love, he said the word slowly, as if tasting it. Love grows, like a seed in a garden. It needs time, patience. But the roots, they are already there. It wasn't the passionate declaration she might have read about in books, but it was something better. It was real. It was a promise. Is that a yes? She asked, a smile finally breaking through the tears in her eyes. Is that a proper proposal? He countered, and she saw a rare, true smile light up his own face. I suppose not, she admitted. How do the Apache propose? There are many ways, he said, but always there is a gift, something made or hunted, a gift that shows you can provide, that you can protect. She looked around the cabin, at the furs from his traps, the food from his garden, the beautiful carvings he had made with his own hands. Then she looked down at the shirt she had made, a symbol of her own skill, her own ability to provide. Then I will make you a gift, she declared, the finest shirt in this entire territory, and when it is finished, I will ask you. Properly. He nodded, a solemn agreement. And I, he said, his thumb gently stroking her cheek, will answer. Properly. The world outside was still full of hate, of danger. But in that small cabin, two outcasts, two survivors, had just forged their own world. One built not on rules and judgment, but on mutual respect, quiet strength, and the fragile, tentative promise of a love that was stronger than any fire. The winter storm hit without warning, a raging blizzard that turned the world into a churning vortex of wind and snow. For 3 days they were trapped. The world shrunk down to the four walls of the cabin. But for Margaret, it was not a prison. It was a haven. She sat by the fire, her needle flashing, putting the final stitches into Tom's shirt. It was more than a shirt. It was a promise, a declaration. Every thread was woven with her hopes for their future. The storm is getting worse, Tom said, coming back inside, a layer of snow covering his broad shoulders. He had been out to check on the small shelter where he kept his horse. He added more wood to the fire, the flames leaping up to greet the fresh fuel. He sat down across from her and picked up a piece of antler he had been working on. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, a comfortable, easy quiet that spoke of a deep and growing connection. What are you making? She asked, holding the finished shirt up to the firelight. He held up his own work. He had carved the antler into an ornate comb, its surface covered in intricate, swirling designs. A wedding gift, he said, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. For when you ask, properly. A warm blush spread across her cheeks. You're very sure of yourself. I am practical, he corrected, a small smile playing on his lips. The storm gives us time to be ready. She folded the finished shirt and set it aside. It's done, she said. He put down his carving and came to her. He took the shirt, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he examined her work. He traced the line of the collar, the cuff of a sleeve. It is very fine work, he said, his voice full of a quiet respect. Too fine for a man like me? No, she said, standing up, taking the shirt from him and holding it against his chest. It is just right. For the man who gave me shelter when I had none. For the man who taught me that I was not broken. For the man who sees me. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, followed by the loud crack and crash of a heavy tree branch falling nearby. We should, Tom began, but he was cut off by another sound, a sound that should not have been there. Voices, faint, desperate, shouting over the roar of the storm. In an instant, Tom had his rifle in his hand. "Stay back," he ordered. But Margaret had already rushed to the door. "Wait! I know that voice! It's Helen, the school teacher!" Tom unbarred the door, and a blast of wind and snow ripped through the cabin. Helen Baker stumbled inside, half frozen and covered in ice. She was not alone. She was supporting another woman, a young woman, heavily pregnant and barely conscious. "Please," Helen gasped, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "You have to help her. The baby. It's coming." They moved in a flurry of action. Tom lifted the pregnant woman as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the warm pallet by the fire. Margaret helped Helen out of her frozen cloak, her mind racing. "What happened? Who is this?" "It's Sarah," Helen explained, her words tumbling out between shivers. "Sarah Whitman, the Reverend's daughter." Margaret stared in disbelief, the daughter of the man who had turned her away from his church door. "Her husband was killed in a mining accident last month," Helen continued. "When her father found out she was with child, he said it was a sin. He cast her out, into this storm." A cold, hard anger settled in Margaret's gut. "I've been hiding her," Helen said, "but the labor started. I couldn't deliver the baby alone. No one else in town would help. They all sided with her father. I hoped, you wouldn't turn us away." "You were right," Margaret said, her voice firm. "Tom, we need hot water, clean cloths, as many as you can find." Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She looked at Margaret, her gaze full of fear and shame. "No," she moaned. I can't bring this scandal to you." "Hush now," Margaret said, her voice softening as she wiped the girl's forehead with a damp cloth. "You're safe here. We will help you." The hours that followed were a trial of fire and ice. Outside, the blizzard raged with a demonic fury. Inside, Sarah labored, her cries sometimes lost in the shriek of the wind. Tom was a rock. He kept the fire blazing, the water hot. His calm, steady presence was an anchor in the storm. Helen, her initial fear gone, proved to be a capable assistant, following Margaret's instructions without question. "They said I'm cursed," Sarah whispered between contractions, her eyes wide with terror. "They said the baby would be marked by my sin. The only mark this baby will have is the mark of being loved," Margaret said fiercely, "and anyone who says otherwise is a fool and a liar." Just as the first pale hints of dawn began to lighten the sky and the storm outside finally began to relent, Sarah's son was born, a tiny, perfect, red-faced boy who announced his arrival with a surprisingly lusty cry. "He's beautiful," Helen breathed, as Margaret cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket. Sarah held her son, tears of relief and sorrow streaming down her face. "But what will I do?" she sobbed. "I have nothing, no home, no way to care for him." Margaret looked at Tom. A silent question passed between them. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "You have a home here," Margaret said to Sarah, "for as long as you need it. The old barn is sturdy. We can fix it up, make it warm and comfortable for you and your son." Sarah stared at her, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But why? After what my father did to you?" "Someone took me in when I was a stranger," Margaret said, her eyes finding Tom's across the room. "It only seems right to pass the kindness on." That evening, after Helen had returned to town under the cover of darkness, Margaret found Tom standing on the porch, looking out at the new world the storm had left behind. "That was a big decision," he said, his voice thoughtful, "taking them in." "I should have asked you first," she said. "I'm sorry." He turned to her, and in the soft light of the rising moon, she saw that he was smiling. "I am not angry," he said. "I am proud. You saw someone in need, and you helped. That is the way." "It will be a full house," she said, a small smile of her own touching her lips. "A cast-out widow and her baby, a fallen woman, and an Apache warrior. What will the people of Cedar Ridge say now?" "Let them talk," Tom said, his smile widening. "We know the truth. We are just good people helping each other. There is no shame in that." Later, as Sarah and her baby slept soundly in the now warm and comfortable barn, Margaret and Tom sat by their fire. The storm was over. The cabin was quiet. Margaret retrieved the shirt she had made. My proposal gift, she said, holding it out to him. He took it, his gaze solemn. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the antler comb. It was finished, polished to a soft, warm gleam. My gift, he said, for your hair, when we stand before the judge. She took the comb, her fingers trembling slightly. You haven't asked the question yet, he reminded her, his voice a low rumble. She put the comb down carefully and took both of his hands in hers. Tom Crow, Feather, she said, her voice clear and strong. Will you marry me? Not for protection, not for propriety, but because you have shown me what true strength and kindness are. Because with you, I am not afraid. Because I want to build a life with you by my side. Yet, he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. I will marry you, Margaret Donnelly, because you are brave, because you are kind, because you see the man, not the name they call me, because the winter is warmer with you here. They will be so angry, she whispered. Bryson, the Reverend, all of them. Yes, he agreed, but we will face them, together. You, me, Sarah, her boy. We will make our own family, our own tribe. Margaret looked around the small cabin, at the crackling fire, at the sleeping bags, at the man holding her hands. She thought of the new mother and her baby, safe and warm in the barn. She was no longer an outcast. She was the heart of this strange, broken, beautiful family. And she was home. Let them rage, she said. We will be too busy living to notice. The morning of their wedding dawned cold and bright. Margaret stood at the window, the carved antler comb in her hair, the green wool dress clean and pressed. Tom stood beside her, wearing the shirt she had made. They didn't have to wait long. Just as the sun cleared the top of the mountains, they saw them coming. A posse of a dozen men, led by Deputy Bryson and Reverend Whitman. They have come to stop us, Tom said, his voice flat. He reached for his rifle. No, Margaret said, putting her hand on his arm. Not today. No more violence. Bryson reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing, his face a mask of self-righteous fury. Margaret Donnelly, we are giving you one last chance to abandon this madness. Margaret and Tom stepped out onto the porch. Sarah came and stood in the doorway of the barn, her baby held tight in her arms. This abomination cannot be allowed, the Reverend thundered, pointing a trembling finger at Sarah. And you, harboring that sinner and her bastard child? My son is not a bastard, Sarah said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength. And I am not a sinner. I am a widow. Something you would know, Father, if you had ever shown me a shred of Christian love. You force our hand, Bryson shouted, gesturing for his men to move forward. We are taking her back to town for her own good. You will do no such thing. The voice was calm, authoritative, and it stopped the men in their tracks. Judge Morrison rode into the clearing, and he was not alone. With him were Marcus Webb, the blacksmith, and Samuel Hart, the feed store owner. And riding in a small wagon behind them was Helen Baker and a tiny, fierce-looking old woman Margaret had never seen before. Gentlemen, the judge said, his eyes sweeping over Bryson's posse, I believe you are interrupting a wedding. You can't be serious, Bryson sputtered. This is against God. It's unnatural. Funny, the old woman said, climbing down from the wagon with surprising agility. I've been reading my Bible for 70-odd years, and I don't recall God appointing you his spokesman deputy. Mrs. Hartwell, the Reverend said, clearly shocked. Surely you don't approve of this. I approve of a woman choosing a good husband over starvation, the old woman sniffed. And I approve of a man who shows kindness when so-called good Christians show none. Seems to me the only thing unnatural here is your own hypocrisy. Marcus, Samuel, Bryson pleaded, turning to his fellow businessmen. You can't support this. I came for a wedding, Webb said with a shrug, and to pick up my new shirts. Business is business. And I brought more fabric, Hart added. Figured the new Mrs. Crow Feather might be looking to expand her business. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. They hadn't all come to condemn. Some had come to stand with her. This isn't over, Bryson snarled, his hand inching toward his gun. You're outnumbered, deputy. Mrs. Hartwell said calmly. Not in guns, perhaps, but in decency. Now, are you going to leave peacefully, or are you going to be the man who started a bloodbath over a wedding? Bryson looked from the judge's cold eyes to Webb's steady gaze, to Mrs. Hartwell's unflinching stare. He was beaten. With a final curse, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his posse trailing sullenly behind him. The ceremony was short and simple, held right there in the cabin. The judge read the words, and they spoke their vows, their voices clear and steady in the quiet room. When the judge said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Tom leaned down and kissed her. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, a kiss that felt like coming home. That evening, after their unlikely wedding guests had departed, Margaret and Tom stood on the porch, watching the sunset, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. "Any regrets?" he asked, his arm warm and solid around her shoulders. "Only one," she said. He looked down at her, a question in his eyes. "That we didn't do this sooner," she said, leaning her head against his chest. Sarah came out from the barn with her son, a tentative smile on her face. "What now?" she asked. "Now," Tom said, pointing to a flat, clear stretch of ground near the cabin. "Now we build a bigger house for our family." Margaret looked at her husband, at this new, strange family they had forged from the ashes of their old lives. A few months ago, she had come to Cedar Ridge with nothing, expecting to die. Now she had everything: a home, a husband, a future. The world outside might still be full of hate, but in here, in this small space they had carved out for themselves, there was only warmth and work and the promise of a new life, rising. If you enjoyed Margaret and Tom's story of survival and love against all odds, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got more tales from the wild frontier coming your way that you won't want to miss. And I want to hear from you. What part of this story touched you the most? Was it Tom's quiet strength or Margaret's incredible resilience? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. It's your engagement that helps stories like this get told. Thanks for listening.